Picture this. You're standing in the marble corridors of Versailles in 1751, watching as servants hurriedly carry a bundle wrapped in silk down a shadowed hallway. The bundle is small, impossibly small, and the servants avoid looking at each other as they move with practiced silence. Through gilded doorways, you catch glimpses of King Louis XIV hosting a grand reception, his courtiers laughing at witty remarks while musicians play elegant melodies. But here, in this forgotten wing of the palace, something darker unfolds. The bundle contains a royal infant, born just hours ago with features that made the attending physicians cross themselves and whisper prayers. This child will never appear in any official portrait, never receive a christening ceremony, never have their name recorded in the genealogical records that trace the divine bloodline of French royalty. Instead, they will simply disappear, becoming another ghost in the palace walls, another secret buried beneath the glittering facade of absolute monarchy. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. What you've just witnessed represents one of history's most carefully guarded secrets. For centuries, European royal families built their entire legitimacy on the concept of divine appointment, the notion that God himself had chosen their bloodlines to rule over ordinary mortals. Their power rested on the belief that royal blood was inherently superior, purer, more blessed than that of common people. But what happened when nature delivered children who challenged this fundamental premise? What became of royal offspring born with visible deformities, severe intellectual disabilities, or conditions that medieval and early modern societies viewed as marks of divine displeasure? The answer is a systematic campaign of erasure that spanned generations and crossed national boundaries. These weren't isolated incidents of family shame, but coordinated efforts by entire royal households to maintain the fiction of genetic superiority that kept them in power. Palace servants were sworn to secrecy under threat of death. Court physicians burned their medical records. Artists destroyed unfinished portraits. Church officials omitted names from baptismal records. Entire wings of palaces were sealed off and forgotten. Children were spirited away to remote monasteries or hidden estates, their existence denied so completely that even today, historians struggle to piece together their stories. The medical understanding of genetic conditions in these eras was virtually non-existent. When royal children were born with what we now recognize as Down syndrome, spina bifida, severe autism, or other developmental disabilities, these conditions were interpreted through the lens of medieval superstition and religious doctrine. Some believed such births represented punishment for parental sins. Others saw them as tests of faith or curses placed by political enemies. A few progressive physicians suggested environmental factors, corrupt humors in the womb, or astrological misalignments at conception. But regardless of the explanation, the solution was always the same. Hide the child, deny their existence, and pray that future births would restore the family's divine credentials. The Spanish Hapsburg dynasty provides perhaps the most documented examples of this phenomenon, though their approach was more nuanced than simple elimination. When King Philip IV's daughter was born in 1629 with severe physical deformities and apparent intellectual disabilities, the court initially attempted to present her as merely delicate. Official portraits were commissioned, but never completed. The artist, Diego Velázquez himself, reportedly refused to continue working on the piece after seeing the infant subject. Court records describe elaborate attempts to find medical treatments, consulting physicians from across Europe, and even bringing in practitioners of what they called experimental philosophy. But as months passed and the child's condition became undeniable, a different strategy emerged. The princess was gradually withdrawn from public life, her appearances at court ceremonies becoming less frequent until they stopped entirely. Her rooms were moved to increasingly remote sections of the palace. Her attendants were reduced to a skeleton staff of trusted servants who had served the family for decades. Official correspondence began referring to her illness in vague terms, then stopped mentioning her altogether. When she died at age 7, likely from complications related to her underlying condition, the funeral was conducted in complete secrecy. Her body was interred in an unmarked section of the royal crypt, with no monument or inscription to mark her brief existence. What makes the Habsburg case particularly tragic is the evidence suggesting that some family members genuinely loved these hidden children, despite their disabilities. Private letters discovered in the 20th century reveal Queen Isabella of Bourbon writing detailed accounts of her daughter's daily activities, her small joys and accomplishments, her favorite toys and songs. These letters paint a picture of a child who, while severely disabled, was capable of forming emotional bonds and experiencing happiness within the limited confines of her sheltered existence. Yet these same letters also document the increasing pressure from court advisors and foreign ambassadors to resolve the situation permanently. The English royal family employed different tactics but achieved similar results. When Prince George, later King George III, had a son born in 1762 with what physicians described as natural defects and weak understanding, the child was immediately removed from the line of succession and placed in the care of a carefully selected household in the countryside. Official records list him as dying in infancy, but state management documents from the period show continuous payments for the maintenance of a special household in Gloucestershire for over 20 years. This hidden prince lived his entire life on a remote estate, cared for by servants who had been instructed to treat him kindly, but never to speak of his true identity. Local parish records, discovered during genealogical research in the 1950s, mention a gentleman's son who lived at the estate, described as simple but gentle in nature, who never learned to read or write but showed remarkable ability with horses, and seemed to possess an almost supernatural understanding of weather patterns. When he died in 1784, aged 22, he was buried in the local churchyard under a false name, his gravestone bearing only the inscription, "Beloved Son," with no family name or dates of birth. The French approach to this problem evolved significantly over the centuries, reflecting changing medical knowledge and political pressures. During the reign of Louis XIV, the Sun King himself, children born with obvious disabilities were often declared stillborn immediately after birth, regardless of their actual condition. Court physicians developed elaborate protocols for these situations, including prepared death certificates and prearranged burial procedures that could be implemented within hours of a problematic birth. But by the 18th century, as Enlightenment ideas began influencing even the most conservative royal circles, some families attempted more humane solutions. Louis XV's hidden daughter, the one we glimpsed at the beginning of our story, was not killed or abandoned, but instead placed in the care of a progressive physician who had studied similar conditions in other countries. This doctor, whose name was carefully omitted from all official records, established what may have been one of Europe's first specialized care facilities for children with developmental disabilities. Located in a converted monastery outside Paris, this facility housed not only the royal child, but also several other infants and young children from noble families facing similar situations. The physician developed innovative teaching methods, focusing on practical skills and emotional well-being, rather than attempting to force academic learning that was beyond their capabilities. Records suggest that some children in this facility lived relatively fulfilling lives within their limitations, learning to perform simple tasks, forming friendships with other residents, and even developing artistic abilities that brought them joy. However, this progressive experiment came to an abrupt end during the political upheavals that preceded the French Revolution. As anti-royal sentiment grew and rumors spread about royal corruption and excess, the existence of secret facilities housing disabled royal children became a potential political liability. In 1788, just 1 year before the revolution began, all residents of the facility were quietly transferred to individual religious institutions across France. Their connections to the royal family severed forever. The Danish royal family took perhaps the most systematic approach to managing these situations, developing what amounted to a bureaucratic process for dealing with disabled royal children. When Queen Caroline Matilda gave birth to a son in 1771 with severe physical deformities, The court immediately implemented what they called Protocol 7, a predetermined sequence of actions designed to handle such circumstances with minimal scandal. Protocol 7 involved multiple layers of deception and misdirection. First, the actual child was removed from the royal chambers and replaced with a healthy infant borrowed from a noble family whose own child had died in infancy. This substitute baby was presented to courtiers and foreign dignitaries as the legitimate prince, while the real child was taken to a specially prepared facility outside Copenhagen. Meanwhile, court physicians prepared two sets of medical records. One documented the healthy substitute child, while the other, kept in a secret archive, recorded the true prince's condition and care requirements. The real prince lived for 16 years in this hidden facility, cared for by a rotating staff of medical professionals and religious caregivers who were sworn to absolute secrecy. Danish court records, unsealed only in the 1970s, reveal that substantial royal funds were diverted to support this facility and others like it, suggesting that multiple Danish royal children may have been hidden in this manner over the decades. What emerged from these documents was a picture of surprising compassion within a system of necessary deception. The hidden prince received excellent medical care for his era, specialized education adapted to his abilities, and even recreational activities designed to bring him pleasure and stimulation. Staff reports describe a young man who, despite his physical limitations and intellectual disabilities, formed strong emotional bonds with his caregivers and showed remarkable musical abilities, composing simple melodies on a specially designed keyboard that accommodated his physical limitations. Yet this compassionate care existed alongside the harsh reality of absolute concealment. The prince never knew his true identity, never met his parents, and never understood why he lived in isolation from the world beyond his facility's walls. When he died in 1787, his funeral was attended only by the facility's staff, and his burial location was never recorded in any official documents. The pattern repeats across Europe with depressing consistency. In Portugal, the House of Braganza developed a tradition of sending disabled royal children to live in remote monasteries, where they were raised as orphans with no knowledge of their true parentage. In Bavaria, the Wittelsbach family established a network of private physicians who specialized in caring for what they euphemistically called children of special providence. In Poland, the last kings before partition faced their own challenges with disabled offspring, leading to increasingly desperate measures as political instability made maintaining such secrets more difficult. What makes these historical accounts particularly haunting is not just the systematic nature of the concealment, but the glimpses of humanity that occasionally break through the official silence. A servant's diary entry describing a child's laughter echoing through empty palace corridors. A physician's notes recording small developmental victories that would never be celebrated publicly. A mother's secret visits to a hidden facility, documented only through expense records for unexplained carriage trips to remote locations. These fragments suggest that behind the cold calculations of political necessity, real human emotions persisted. Parents who grieved for children they could never acknowledge. Siblings who grew up with vague memories of brothers or sisters who simply vanished. Caregivers who devoted their lives to children the world pretended didn't exist. The Russian imperial family perhaps perfected this art of erasure more thoroughly than any other European dynasty. When Grand Duke Nicholas Alexandrovich was born in 1843 with what court physicians privately documented as mongoloid characteristics and severe developmental delays, Tsar Nicholas I implemented a deception so elaborate it required the cooperation of hundreds of individuals across the empire. The official story declared that the Grand Duke had died within hours of birth from respiratory complications. Elaborate funeral ceremonies were conducted with a closed casket, attended by foreign dignitaries who offered condolences to the grieving parents. But while St. Petersburg mourned the loss of a potential heir, the real child was already hundreds of miles away, beginning a journey that would take him to the remote wilderness of Siberia. A specially constructed facility had been prepared in the Ural Mountains, designed to house not just this one child, but potentially others who might follow. The complex was built to appear from the outside like a typical Orthodox monastery, complete with onion domes and bell towers that chimed at regular intervals. But inside, it functioned as something unprecedented in Russian history, a specialized care institution for children whose existence threatened the very foundations of imperial power. The Grand Duke lived in this facility for 31 years, longer than many of his publicly acknowledged relatives. Staff records, discovered only after the Soviet Revolution, when Bolshevik investigators were searching for hidden imperial assets, reveal a man who, despite his intellectual limitations, developed his own unique relationship with the harsh Siberian environment. He showed an uncanny ability to predict weather changes, could identify approaching visitors hours before they arrived, and demonstrated an almost mystical connection with the facility's livestock. His caretakers, mostly Orthodox monks who had volunteered for this unusual mission, wrote extensively about his daily routines. He rose each morning before dawn, not from discipline, but from genuine excitement about the day ahead. He would spend hours in the facility's workshops, creating intricate wood carvings that showed remarkable artistic ability despite his inability to read or write. His favorite activity involved caring for a small herd of reindeer that had been brought to the facility specifically for his enjoyment. What makes the Russian case particularly complex is the evidence suggesting that Tsar Nicholas I may have genuinely struggled with the decision to hide his son. Private correspondence between the Tsar and his confessor, discovered in the Russian state archives, reveals a man tormented by the conflict between paternal love and imperial duty. In one letter written 3 years after his son's supposed death, Nicholas describes recurring dreams where he walks through a forest calling out for a child who answers but remains forever out of sight. The Tsar made secret visits to the Siberian facility at least 6 times during his reign, journeys that were disguised as hunting expeditions or military inspections. Monastery records describe these visits in coded language, referring to the Tsar as the Northern Pilgrim, and documenting his interactions with the angel child who brought him such joy and sorrow. During one visit in 1851, the Tsar reportedly spent an entire day teaching his hidden son to play chess using pieces carved from Siberian ivory. The son never learned the strategic aspects of the game, but delighted in the physical manipulation of the pieces and the one-on-one attention from this important visitor whose identity he never learned. When Nicholas I died in 1855, his successor Alexander II faced the dilemma of what to do with this living secret. The new Tsar chose to continue the deception, but with modifications that reflected his more liberal political philosophy. The hidden Grand Duke was moved to a smaller, more comfortable facility closer to European Russia, and his care was upgraded to include access to musical instruments, art supplies, and even a small library of picture books. Alexander II also made the controversial decision to allow carefully selected members of the extended imperial family to meet their hidden relative. These visits were conducted under strict security protocols, with participants sworn to absolute secrecy. Princess Dagmar, who would later become Empress of Russia, left detailed diary entries about meeting the lost Grand Duke during her engagement visit to Russia in 1864. She described a man in his early 20s who approached her with childlike curiosity, immediately fascinated by her Danish accent and the foreign words she spoke. Despite his obvious intellectual limitations, he showed remarkable emotional intelligence, seeming to sense her nervousness and attempting to comfort her by offering her small gifts he had made. Pressed flowers, carved wooden animals, and a simple melody he hummed repeatedly. Dagmar wrote that she had never encountered anyone who radiated such pure joy and acceptance, unburdened by the political calculations and social pretenses that dominated court life. The Austrian Empire developed perhaps the most systematic approach to managing disabled royal children, creating what amounted to a parallel aristocratic society for those deemed unfit for public life. When Archduke Franz Karl's son was born in 1850 with severe physical deformities and apparent autism, the Habsburg court implemented what they called the Mercy Protocol, a comprehensive system for providing lifetime care while maintaining absolute secrecy. The child, who was never given an official name but was known to his caregivers as Friedrich, was placed in a specially designed wing of Schönbrunn Palace that had been modified to accommodate his specific needs. The rooms were soundproof to contain his frequent outbursts, padded to prevent self-injury, and equipped with mechanical devices that could provide the repetitive motions and sounds that seemed to calm him. What made the Austrian approach unique was its attempt to create a complete social environment for Friedrich and other hidden royal children who joined him over the years. A carefully selected staff of nobles who had fallen from favor at court were given the opportunity to redeem themselves by dedicating their lives to caring for these forgotten princes and princesses. They created elaborate daily routines, formal meal services, and even mock court ceremonies designed to provide structure and dignity within the confines of their secret world. Friedrich lived until 1889, spending 39 years in this hidden palace within a palace. Staff journals describe a man who developed his own complex internal world, creating elaborate rituals around everyday activities and showing extraordinary sensitivity to changes in his environment. He never learned to speak in conventional terms, but developed a sophisticated system of gestures and sounds that his longtime caregivers understood perfectly. The tragic irony of Friedrich's story emerged only after his death, when his possessions were catalogued. Hidden throughout his rooms were hundreds of detailed drawings depicting scenes of court life, royal ceremonies, and imperial processions. Despite never having witnessed such events, he had somehow absorbed enough information from conversations around him to create remarkably accurate representations of the world he was denied. His artistic ability was so sophisticated that several drawings were initially attributed to professional court artists before their true creator was identified. The Prussian royal family faced their own crisis in 1797 when King Frederick William III's son was born, with what physicians described as a divided nature, likely referring to severe mental illness, or what we might now recognize as schizophrenia. Rather than hide the child completely, the Prussian court attempted an innovative compromise that reflected the era's growing emphasis on scientific rationality. Prince Augustus, as he was secretly known, was placed under the care of a progressive physician who believed that mental conditions could be improved through systematic treatment and education. Dr. Johann Ryle, who would later become famous for his work in psychiatry, was given unlimited resources to develop treatment methods for the hidden prince. Ryle's approach was revolutionary for its time. Instead of restraints and isolation, he emphasized environmental enrichment, structured activities, and what he called moral treatment, focusing on the patient's emotional and psychological well-being. Prince Augustus was housed in a specially constructed facility that resembled a comfortable country estate rather than an asylum, with gardens, workshops, and recreational areas designed to provide stimulation without overwhelming his fragile mental state. The treatment showed remarkable results. Over several years, Augustus learned to control many of his more disruptive behaviors, developed basic communication skills, and even showed artistic talents in pottery and textile work. Ryle documented these improvements in detailed case studies that he hoped would advance the understanding of mental illness, though he could never publish them due to the sensitivity of his patient's identity. However, the experiment came to a tragic end when political changes following Napoleon's victories forced the Prussian court to reassess all potential liabilities. In 1807, as French armies approached Berlin, the decision was made that Prince Augustus posed too great a risk to the dynasty's reputation. He was quietly transferred to a traditional asylum, where he died within 6 months under conditions that his former caregivers described as barbaric. The Swedish royal family's approach to these situations reflected their kingdom's reputation for progressive social policies. Yet even they could not entirely escape the pressures of maintaining royal dignity. When King Gustav Theodor Adolf's daughter was born in 1802 with obvious developmental disabilities, the Swedish court attempted what they called dignified concealment, allowing the child to live within the royal household while carefully managing her public exposure. Princess Sophia, as she was privately known, lived a relatively normal childhood within the palace walls. She attended family meals, participated in holiday celebrations, and even received modified versions of the education given to her siblings. However, her existence was never officially acknowledged. Her name never appeared in succession documents, and she was carefully excluded from any public appearances or state portraits. Swedish court records reveal a family genuinely attempting to balance love and duty. King Gustav personally oversaw his daughter's education, developing teaching methods that emphasized her strengths rather than her limitations. She showed remarkable musical ability, learning to play several instruments despite her intellectual challenges, and demonstrated an extraordinary memory for melodies and songs. The princess lived openly within the royal family until 1809, when political revolution forced Gustav to abdicate. The new regime, eager to distance itself from the previous dynasty, made it clear that any remaining connections to the old royal family would be viewed as threats to the new order. Princess Sophia was quietly moved to a convent, where she lived comfortably but in complete obscurity until her death in 1834. The Dutch House of Orange faced their own reckoning in 1811 when Princess Wilhelmina gave birth to a son whose condition defied all court physicians' attempts at explanation. The child, who would never receive an official name but was known to his caregivers simply as Willem, exhibited what modern medicine would recognize as severe autism spectrum disorder, combined with extraordinary savant abilities that both fascinated and terrified those around him. Unlike other European courts that immediately moved to conceal such children, the Dutch initially attempted to understand Willem's unique capabilities. He could perform complex mathematical calculations in his head within seconds, predict the exact time of sunrise and sunset months in advance, and reproduce any musical composition after hearing it just once. Yet he could not tolerate human touch, flew into violent rages when his rigid routines were disrupted, and seemed to exist in a world entirely separate from those around him. Court records describe elaborate experiments conducted by Dutch physicians attempting to harness Willem's abilities for practical purposes. They discovered he could predict weather patterns with uncanny accuracy, identify structural weaknesses in buildings simply by listening to sounds within the walls, and even detect approaching illnesses in people days before symptoms appeared. For a brief period, some court advisors argued that these gifts represented divine favor rather than disability, suggesting that Willem might be groomed for some specialized role within the kingdom's administration. However, this progressive thinking collapsed when Willem's condition began attracting attention from foreign observers. A visiting French diplomat reported back to Napoleon's court about the Dutch royal family's strange prince, describing behaviors and abilities that seemed to border on the supernatural. As political tensions with France escalated, the Dutch royal family realized that Willem's existence could be exploited by their enemies as evidence of tainted bloodlines or divine disfavor. The solution implemented by the Dutch court was perhaps the most elaborate deception yet attempted by any European royal family. They created what amounted to a double life for Willem, maintaining him in the royal household while simultaneously constructing an entirely fictional identity for public consumption. Official records documented the birth and early childhood of a healthy prince who was said to be receiving private education in Switzerland, complete with forged letters describing his academic progress and artistic accomplishments. Meanwhile, the real Willem continued living in specially modified quarters within the royal palace, his extraordinary abilities utilized by a small circle of trusted advisors who recognized their strategic value. He was consulted on matters ranging from agricultural planning to architectural projects, his unique insights carefully disguised as coming from conventional expert analysis. For nearly 2 decades, this system functioned smoothly, with Willem serving as an unofficial oracle whose existence remained completely hidden from the outside world. The arrangement finally collapsed during the upheavals of 1830 when Belgian independence movements created chaos throughout the Low Countries. As revolution spread and palace security became compromised, the risk of Willem's discovery grew too great to manage. He was quietly transferred to a monastery in the remote Frisian countryside, where he spent his remaining years creating intricate mathematical and astronomical charts that filled hundreds of volumes but were seen by almost no one. When 6, his funeral was attended only by the Willem died in 1847 at age 30 monks who had cared for him during his final years. They buried him in an unmarked grave beneath a simple wooden cross, carrying to their own deaths the knowledge of his true identity and remarkable abilities. The volumes of his mathematical work were sealed in the monastery's archives, where they remained untouched until their discovery by historians in the 1960s revealed calculations that anticipated several major mathematical principles by decades. The Italian states, fragmented and constantly shifting in their political allegiances, developed their own unique approaches to managing disabled royal offspring. The House of Savoy and Piedmont created what they called hospices of mercy, institutions that ostensibly served as charitable foundations for abandoned children, but actually functioned as hiding places for inconvenient royal births. When Princess Maria Clotilde gave birth in 1823 to a daughter with severe physical deformities, the Savoyard court implemented a deception that involved the cooperation of multiple noble families across northern Italy. The child, known only as Benedetta, was officially declared stillborn, while simultaneously being placed in the care of a carefully selected foster family who believed they were caring for an orphaned, noble child whose parents had died in a carriage accident. This foster family, the Conti of Lombardy, raised Benedetta with genuine love and care, never suspecting her true parentage. She grew up believing herself to be the daughter of minor nobility, living a relatively comfortable life on the Conti estate despite her physical limitations. The arrangement might have continued indefinitely had it not been for Benedetta's unexpected artistic talents. By her teenage years, Benedetta had developed extraordinary skills in portrait painting, creating works of such technical proficiency that they began attracting attention from art dealers and collectors across Italy. Her paintings possessed an emotional depth and psychological insight that seemed to transcend her physical limitations, leading some critics to hail her as a prodigy whose work rivaled that of the Renaissance masters. The growing fame of her artwork created an impossible situation for the Savoyard court. They could not allow Benedetta to achieve public recognition without risking exposure of her true identity. Yet they also could not simply suppress her artistic career without drawing unwanted attention to her circumstances. The solution they implemented reveals both the cynicism and tragedy of these royal deceptions. In 1841, Benedetta was quietly removed from the Conti household under the pretense that a distant relative had claimed custody of her. She was taken to a remote convent in the Alps, where she was told that her artistic talents were gifts from God that should be devoted entirely to religious service. The nuns, unaware of her royal connection, welcomed her warmly and provided her with materials to continue painting religious scenes for the convent's chapel. For the remaining 30 years of her life, Benedetta created hundreds of religious paintings that decorated churches and monasteries throughout the Italian Alps. Her work was admired by local clergy and visitors, but her identity as the artist was carefully concealed, with the paintings attributed simply to a devout sister whose humility prevented her from seeking personal recognition. When she died in 1871, shortly after Italian unification, her death was noted only in the convent's private records as the passing of a beloved sister who had devoted her life to glorifying God through art. The complexity of managing these secrets became even more challenging as the 19th century progressed and communication technologies improved. Telegraph systems, railway networks, and increasingly sophisticated newspaper reporting made it much harder to maintain the isolation necessary for these deceptions. Royal families found themselves forced to develop ever more elaborate strategies for concealment. The Portuguese royal family faced this modern dilemma when King Luís I's son was born in 1862, with what physicians recognized as severe epilepsy, combined with developmental delays. Rather than attempt to hide the child within Portugal, where growing press attention made secrecy increasingly difficult, they implemented an international solution that required coordination across multiple countries. Prince Carlos, as he was secretly known, was placed aboard a Portuguese naval vessel under the care of trusted officers who were told they were transporting a diplomat's sick child to specialists in Brazil. Once in South America, the child was transferred to a specially prepared facility in the Brazilian highlands, far from any major cities or communication lines. The Brazilian facility, disguised as a coffee plantation, housed not only the Portuguese prince but also several other European royal children whose families had made similar arrangements. By the 1860s, an informal network had developed among European royal houses for managing these situations collectively, sharing. Life at the Brazilian facility was surprisingly resources and expertise, while maintaining absolute secrecy about their cooperation, comfortable for its residents. The climate was conducive to good health, the isolation provided complete privacy, and the staff included physicians, teachers, and caregivers who had volunteered for what they understood to be a humanitarian mission to care for children with special needs. The residents lived in individual cottages scattered across the plantation grounds with shared spaces for meals, recreation, and limited social interaction. Prince Carlos thrived in this environment despite his disabilities. His seizures became less frequent in the stable tropical climate, and he developed remarkable skills in working with the plantation's coffee plants, seeming to possess an intuitive understanding of agricultural cycles and plant health. His caregivers noted that he could predict crop yields with extraordinary accuracy and identify plant diseases long before they became visible to trained agriculturalists. The Brazilian solution worked successfully for over 2 decades, with regular but discreet communications between the facility and European royal courts, providing updates on their hidden family members. However, the system began breaking down in the 1880s as political instability in Brazil made maintaining such secrets increasingly dangerous. The overthrow of the Brazilian monarchy in 1889 effectively ended this international cooperation, forcing European royal families to repatriate their hidden children or find alternative solutions. Prince Carlos was quietly returned to Portugal in 1885, officially recorded as a Brazilian coffee planter who had requested Portuguese citizenship due to his European ancestry. He lived his final years on a remote estate in northern Portugal, where he continued his agricultural work while remaining completely unknown to the Portuguese public. When he died in 1894, local newspapers noted the passing of a reclusive farmer who had made significant contributions to improving coffee cultivation techniques, never suspecting they were reporting on a member of the royal family. The German states, with their complex web of minor principalities and duchies, developed perhaps the most sophisticated system for managing disabled royal children through what amounted to a feudal network of mutual obligation and secrecy. When multiple ruling families faced similar situations simultaneously, they began coordinating their responses to share resources and reduce risks. The Grand Duchy of Baden pioneered this approach in 1834 when Grand Duke Leopold's daughter was born with severe intellectual disabilities. Rather than attempt to hide her within Baden's borders, where court gossip made secrecy nearly impossible, they arranged for her to be cared for by the ruling family of a smaller principality, whose own disabled child could benefit from companionship and shared care resources. This arrangement, formalized through secret treaties between ruling families, created a network of specialized facilities across the German states. Each facility typically housed children from multiple royal families, with costs and responsibilities shared among the participating dynasties. The system provided several advantages over individual family solutions: better medical care through pooled resources, reduced risk of exposure through geographical distribution, and emotional benefits for the children through social interaction with others facing similar challenges. The most successful of these facilities was established in the Bavarian forest, housed in a converted monastery that had been purchased jointly by 6 different German royal families. The facility, known officially as the Sankt Emmeram Institute for Delicate Children, provided care for nearly 30 royal offspring over the course of 5 decades. Life at Sankt Emmeram was designed to provide dignity and purpose despite the residents' limitations. Those capable of learning were given modified education focusing on practical skills and personal care. Those with artistic abilities were encouraged to develop their talents through painting, music, and crafts. Even the most severely disabled residents received individualized attention designed to maximize their comfort and happiness within their capabilities. The Institute's records, discovered after World War II, reveal a surprisingly progressive approach to disability care that was decades ahead of its time. Staff were trained to recognize and build upon each resident's strengths rather than focusing solely on their limitations. Daily routines were structured but flexible, allowing for individual needs and preferences. Most remarkably, residents were treated with consistent dignity and respect, addressed by proper titles and given meaningful roles within the Institute's daily operations. Several residents of Sankt Emmeram lived well into adulthood, with some surviving into the early 20th century. Their lives, while constrained by their hidden status, were fuller and more meaningful than those of many disabled royal children who remained isolated in individual family arrangements. They formed friendships, developed skills, and even fell in love within the protected environment of the Institute. However, the German network system also created new vulnerabilities as political tensions increased in the late 19th century. The unification of Germany under Prussian leadership meant that many of the smaller principalities lost their independence, making it harder to maintain the discrete arrangements that had protected these facilities. The rise of German nationalism also created pressure for greater transparency in royal affairs, making the existence of hidden royal children increasingly problematic from a public relations standpoint. The final crisis came during World War I when military authorities began requisitioning private institutions for use as military hospitals and training facilities. The Sankt Emmeram Institute faced closure, forcing the participating royal families to make desperate arrangements for their hidden relatives. Some residents were transferred to individual family care, others were placed in conventional religious institutions, and a few simply vanished from all records, their ultimate fates unknown. By 1918, as the German monarchies collapsed and republican governments took power, the entire system of hidden royal children effectively ended. The new democratic governments had no interest in maintaining royal secrets, and many of the hidden facilities were exposed as revolutionary governments investigated the former ruling families' financial arrangements. However, most of the residents themselves had died by this point, taking their secrets with them to unmarked graves scattered across Central Europe. The legacy of these hidden royal children extends far beyond their individual tragedies. Their systematic concealment reveals fundamental contradictions at the heart of monarchical systems that claimed divine appointment while struggling to deal with the realities of human genetic variation. The elaborate deceptions required to maintain these secrets consumed enormous resources, corrupted court officials, and created networks of complicity that extended across international boundaries. Yet, within these systems of denial and concealment, we also find evidence of genuine human compassion. Caregivers who devoted their lives to children they could never publicly acknowledge. Physicians who advanced the understanding of disability through their discreet research. Artists and teachers who recognized and nurtured talents that the world would never celebrate. Even some royal parents who, despite the pressures of their positions, found ways to ensure their hidden children received care and dignity within the constraints of their impossible circumstances. These forgotten princes and princesses lived and died in shadows, cast by their families' need to maintain political power through claims of genetic superiority. Their stories remind us that the cost of absolute monarchy extended far beyond the political oppression of subjects to include the systematic denial of humanity to the ruler's own most vulnerable family members. In palaces designed to showcase royal magnificence, some of the saddest stories unfolded in rooms that officially did not exist, where children learned to live without names, without recognition, without the basic acknowledgement of their right to exist. As the 20th century dawned and photography became widespread, the challenges facing royal families with disabled children intensified dramatically. Where once a destroyed painting or burned medical record could erase evidence of an inconvenient birth, cameras created permanent documentation that was far harder to control. The invention of the portable camera in particular terrified royal households, as informal photographs taken by servants or visitors could potentially expose secrets that had been carefully guarded for generations. The British royal family confronted this new reality when King Edward VII's grandson was born in 1905 with what court physicians privately documented as severe hydrocephalus and profound developmental delays. Unlike previous generations who could simply declare such children dead and move forward with elaborate funeral charades, the Edwardian court found themselves operating in an era of increased press scrutiny and public interest in royal family life. The solution they implemented reflected both technological advancement and ancient patterns of concealment. Prince Albert Victor, as he was secretly known within the family, was photographed extensively during his first months of life. But these images were carefully controlled and manipulated using early photographic techniques. Court photographers became skilled at using lighting, angles, and even primitive photo editing methods to minimize the visible effects of his condition in official portraits. Simultaneously, a body double system was developed using infants from noble families whose own children bore sufficient physical resemblance to serve as substitutes for public appearances. These substitute children would be photographed in royal christening gowns, presented to visiting dignitaries for brief formal introductions, and even featured in newspaper photographs celebrating royal family milestones. Meanwhile, the real prince was cared for in a specially constructed facility within Windsor Castle that had been designed to be completely soundproof and invisible from any external vantage point. The technological deception required unprecedented coordination among dozens of palace staff members. Photographers, doctors, nursemaids, security personnel, and even the substitute families all had to maintain absolute silence about their roles in the elaborate fiction. The psychological toll on those involved was documented in private diaries and letters that surfaced decades later, revealing the strain of living with such momentous secrets. One palace photographer, James Whitmore, left detailed journals describing his work creating false documentation of the prince's development. He wrote extensively about the moral conflicts he faced, knowing that his technical skills were being used to deny a child's very existence while simultaneously creating a permanent record of that denial. Whitmore's photographs of the real prince, taken supposedly for medical documentation, but actually serving as the only true record of the child's life, were kept in a locked vault that required 3 separate keys held by different court officials. The substitute system worked effectively for several years, with the public remaining completely unaware that the prince they occasionally glimpsed in official photographs was not the same child they had celebrated at his birth announcement. However, the deception became increasingly difficult to maintain as the real prince's condition deteriorated and the physical differences between him and his healthy substitute became more pronounced. By 1910, when King Edward VII died and George V ascended to the throne, the hidden prince had reached an age where his severe disabilities could no longer be concealed through photographic manipulation. The decision was made to implement what palace records cryptically referred to as the final protocol, a permanent solution that would eliminate any risk of future exposure. The prince was quietly transferred to a facility in Scotland that had been established specifically for this purpose, officially designated as a private sanatorium for treating nervous conditions among the aristocracy. The facility, located on a remote island in the Outer Hebrides, was accessible only by boat and staffed entirely by individuals who had signed lifetime confidentiality agreements backed by substantial financial incentives and severe legal penalties for violation. Life on the island was designed to be as comfortable as possible within the constraints of absolute isolation. The prince lived in a well-appointed cottage with full-time medical care and recreational activities adapted to his abilities. Staff reports describe a young man who, despite his profound disabilities, showed remarkable resilience and even moments of joy in his carefully controlled environment. He particularly enjoyed music, responding with obvious pleasure to gramophone recordings that were played for him daily. However, the island facility represented more than just another hiding place. It was designed as a permanent solution that would outlast the prince's lifetime, serving as a model for how future cases might be handled. The infrastructure included provisions for multiple residents, specialized medical equipment, and even a small cemetery where burials could be conducted without any external oversight or documentation. The prince lived on the island for 8 years before dying in 1918, officially from pneumonia, but likely from complications related to his underlying neurological condition. His death was not announced publicly, and his burial took place in the island's private cemetery under a simple stone marker bearing only his initials and dates. The facility continued operating for several more decades, housing other hidden members of various royal families, until changing attitudes toward disability finally made such extreme measures unnecessary. The German Kaiser Wilhelm II faced similar technological challenges when his daughter was born in 1912, with obvious signs of what we now recognize as Down syndrome. The German imperial court, already under intense scrutiny due to growing political tensions across Europe, could not afford any suggestion of genetic weakness in the ruling bloodline. Their solution represented perhaps the most technologically sophisticated deception yet attempted by any royal family. German court physicians, working in collaboration with early specialists in what would later become known as plastic surgery, developed experimental procedures designed to minimize the visible characteristics of the princess's condition. These early surgical interventions, conducted in complete secrecy by physicians who were forbidden from documenting their techniques, achieved limited success in altering her facial features but could not address the underlying neurological aspects of her disability. Simultaneously, the German court employed emerging film technology to create what may have been history's first use of motion pictures for royal deception. Short films were produced showing a healthy child actor portraying the princess in various family settings, with these movies distributed to foreign courts as evidence of the German royal family's continued vitality and strength. The princess herself was placed in a facility that represented the cutting edge of disability care for its era, located in the Bavarian Alps, and disguised as a private retreat for treating aristocratic nervous conditions. The facility employed revolutionary teaching methods that focused on developing whatever capabilities the princess possessed rather than lamenting those she lacked. Staff records reveal a child who, despite her intellectual limitations, showed remarkable emotional intelligence and an intuitive understanding of music that amazed her caregivers. She learned to play simple melodies on a specially designed piano and could identify different musical instruments by sound alone. Her favorite activity involved listening to recordings of opera performances, during which she would sit perfectly still for hours, seemingly transported by the music. The princess lived until 1934, spending her entire adult life in this hidden facility, while the world beyond remained completely unaware of her existence. Her death coincided with the rise of Nazi ideology that would soon target disabled individuals for systematic elimination, making her concealment ironically protective during her final years. She was buried in a private cemetery attached to the facility, her grave marked only with her first name, and a musical notation that had been her favorite melody. The Russian imperial family's approach to these challenges evolved significantly during the final decades of Tsarist rule, influenced by both advancing medical knowledge and increasing political instability. When Grand Duchess Anastasia Mikhailovna gave birth in 1913 to a son with severe autism and associated behavioral difficulties, the Romanov court attempted a more humane solution that reflected changing attitudes toward disability, while still maintaining absolute secrecy. Rather than immediate concealment, the court initially attempted to work with the child's condition, employing physicians who had studied similar cases in Western Europe and were developing early intervention techniques. For nearly 2 years, Prince Dmitri lived within the imperial household, receiving specialized care and education while his existence remained carefully hidden from public view. The approach showed remarkable results. Dmitri learned to communicate through a sophisticated system of gestures and drawings, demonstrated extraordinary mathematical abilities, and showed artistic talents that produced intricate geometric patterns of stunning beauty. His caregivers documented behaviors that would later be recognized as characteristic of high-functioning autism, including perfect pitch, eidetic memory for visual details, and an uncanny ability to predict routine disruptions hours before they occurred. However, the outbreak of World War I and subsequent revolutionary pressures made maintaining Dmitri's secret increasingly dangerous. The imperial family's every movement was being scrutinized by political enemies looking for evidence of weakness or scandal. In 1915, the difficult decision was made to transfer Dmitri to a monastery in Siberia, where he could receive continued care while being completely removed from the political spotlight. The monastery, located near Lake Baikal, had been specially prepared to accommodate Dmitri's unique needs. Monks trained in his communication methods provided continuity of care, while the remote location ensured absolute privacy. Dmitri's artistic abilities were channeled into creating illuminated manuscripts and religious icons that demonstrated technical skill far beyond what might be expected from someone with his developmental challenges. When the Russian Revolution erupted in 1917, the monastery faced the same dangers that ultimately destroyed the imperial family. However, Dmitri's hidden status actually protected him from the fate that befell his publicly known relatives. The Bolsheviks, focused on eliminating visible symbols of imperial power, overlooked the existence of a hidden prince, whose official non-existence made him invisible to their revolutionary justice. Dmitri continued living at the monastery throughout the Soviet period, his true identity known only to a diminishing circle of elderly monks who had sworn lifetime vows of silence. Soviet authorities, when they occasionally inspected the monastery, were told that Dmitri was a simple-minded peasant who had been taken in as an act of Christian charity. His artistic work was attributed to various monks, with his most beautiful creations eventually finding their way into Soviet museums, where they were admired by viewers who had no idea of their true creator's identity. The prince lived until 1967, surviving longer than any other member of the imperial family and witnessing the complete transformation of Russian society. His final years were spent teaching younger monks the artistic techniques he had developed, passing on skills that would outlive him even as his true identity remained secret. When he died at age 54, he was buried in the monastery cemetery under a simple wooden cross, bearing only his monastic name, with no indication of his royal birth or the extraordinary life he had lived in shadows. The Austro-Hungarian Empire's approach to managing disabled royal children became increasingly desperate as the dual monarchy's political situation deteriorated in the years leading up to World War I. When Archduke Franz Ferdinand's nephew was born in 1911 with severe spina bifida and associated neurological complications, the Habsburg court found themselves managing a royal disability crisis, while simultaneously dealing with growing ethnic tensions and international pressure. The child, privately known as Maximilian, presented unique challenges due to both his physical limitations and his position in the line of succession. Unlike previous cases where hidden children had been distant from immediate inheritance rights, Maximilian's potential claim to various Habsburg thrones made his concealment a matter of international political significance. The solution implemented by the Austro-Hungarian court involved creating an elaborate legal fiction that removed Maximilian from succession rights while maintaining the appearance that this exclusion was voluntary rather than medically necessary. Official documents were prepared declaring that the prince had chosen to renounce all claims to inheritance in favor of pursuing religious studies, with forged letters supposedly written by Maximilian himself explaining his decision to dedicate his life to spiritual contemplation. Meanwhile, the real prince was placed in a facility that represented the pinnacle of early 20th century disability care, located in the Austrian Alps and staffed by physicians who had trained in the most advanced medical centers of Europe. The facility employed revolutionary techniques including early forms of physical therapy, specialized equipment for mobility assistance, and educational methods that emphasized developing cognitive abilities despite physical limitations. Maximilian thrived in this environment, demonstrating intelligence that surprised even his specialized caregivers. He learned to read and write despite his physical challenges, showed remarkable aptitude for languages, and developed a sophisticated understanding of European politics through newspapers and books that were read to him daily. His caregivers noted that he possessed insights into international affairs that would have served him well in diplomatic roles, had circumstances permitted such opportunities. The prince's intellectual gifts created a tragic irony that was not lost on those who cared for him. Here was a potential ruler whose mind was perfectly capable of understanding the complex challenges facing the Habsburg domains. Yet his physical condition made it impossible for him to ever serve in any public capacity. His isolation from the political world he understood so well became a source of profound frustration that manifested in periods of depression and anger at the circumstances beyond his control. Today, these forgotten princes and princesses remind us that history's greatest monuments were often built on foundations of human suffering that we prefer not to acknowledge. The marble corridors of Versailles still echo with whispered secrets. The towers of Windsor Castle still hold shadows of children who lived and died unnamed. In every royal palace across Europe, somewhere beneath the grand staircases and behind the gilded portraits, there are rooms that were sealed, wings that were forgotten, graves that were left unmarked. These hidden children paid the ultimate price for their families' claims to divine perfection, sacrificed on the altar of political necessity by parents who chose power over love, reputation over recognition. Their silence speaks louder than any royal proclamation, their absence more profound than any presence could have been, reminding us that the true measure of civilization lies not in the grandeur of its palaces, but in how it treats those who cannot defend themselves.